Okay. Hi, good evening, and welcome to the CSH monthly seminar. Today we have with us Smriti Singh, who will be speaking on her recently published book by Routledge, which is titled The Middle Class in Neo-Urban India, Space, Class and Distinction. So before she begins, I'll just briefly introduce both the speaker and the discussant. Smriti is an assistant professor of sociology at the Department of Social Sciences and Humanities and is associated with the Urban Research Lab at the Indraprasth Information Technology Institute, Delhi. She obtained her doctorate from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi and also was a Fulbright Nehru scholar. Her research focuses on question of urban space, community, and identity. Her talk will be followed by discussion, and we have Ishita Chatterjee as the book discussant. Ishita is an associate professor at the Jindal School of Design and Architecture, OP Jindal Global University. She is an architect and urban designer who worked in India and China before joining academia. She holds a PhD from the University of Melbourne, and her research focuses on informal urbanism, housing justice, spatial justice, environmental justice, ecological debt, and architectural pedagogy. So, after Smriti concludes her talk, and after the remarks from our discussant, we will open the floor for Q&A. And also, in the meantime, those who are attending talk online, you can type your questions in the chat box. We can read out to Smriti. Also, we request those who are present online, please mute your mics. And Smriti, you have 45 minutes to speak and conclude your talk. Now, over to you. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rama. I would like to thank CSH for hosting me here for my book talk. And a special thanks to Rama for facilitating this for us. It's an honor to be doing this alongside my friend, Ishita. And I'm hoping that I will be able to answer because she has extremely pointed and extremely smart questions. So I'm kind of hoping I can meet it with the same amount of smart. Thank you so much for everyone who's joining online, those who have joined me offline for this talk. This is a book that came out in November 2023. And this is the second book talk that I'm having. So I'm going to do this in a way that is more accessible. The talk is kind of structured around the basic premise of the work so that it flags off. So I am using this as an opportunity to talk about what has gone into the work, but what is also at the foundation of the work. And so it's an opportunity to think with me. It's an opportunity to take this as an impetus to think in terms of research in this particular direction. So without further ado, this is not working. All right. So I'll start with the story of the book, which I think would be far more interesting as we move forward. The original research problem that I had taken on was supposed to look at the educational practices among the new middle class, because Fernandez's book had come out in 2006, and this was all the buzz that was going around in India at that point of time. And going through the literature had me believe that this is a consolidated section of middle class that can actually be studied as a group, as a community. And so my idea was to go and study the educational practices and look at how those educational practices align with the kind of discourses that have been flagged in terms of new middle class. However, when I went for my pilot fieldwork, the observations revealed something very different happening within the city. And so I started to dig around and try to get a sense of exactly what was going on, what was this tension that I was constantly coming face to face with. It was palpable. And so I wanted to understand exactly what was happening. There is a local ancestral agrarian community. And so I started reading up about them. I got a sense that there was some kind of a hostility that I was seeing. So I went back and I checked news listings, everything that I could find on what was happening around that time. My fieldwork happened between 2013 and 2014. And around that time, there were a number of the kind of news clipping that you can see on the screen currently. Those kind of news clippings were very, very, they were very common. And so this, alongside the fact that I am sensing something different happening at the grassroots level, caused me to go back and relaunch into this kind of a research with a fresh mind of looking at what exactly is happening. There was a very specific, there were three specific things which I noticed happening in the field that caught my attention, and I wanted to explore what was going on there underneath it. One was the Ragiri, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but this is like the Bogota Cyclovia festival, the kind of thing that happens in Bogota, which is cordoning off of a street for extremely aesthetic purposes like graffiti on the road or road art or cycling and gymnastics and hula hoop and stuff like that. And so this was happening on a routine basis. This was the third or fourth year of Ragiri happening consistently. It shaped the ways in which there was a middle class that was associated with it, which looked at itself as being distinctly different from the local ancestral agrarian community, marked itself as being sophisticated, educated. And so I wanted to understand exactly what is this relationship, where is this sense of distinction emerging from? And that was the question that I went back with. The contestation between LAAC, which is the local ancestral agrarian community, and the middle class section that I was looking at, over dominating the ways in which the city should be understood, should be read, should be utilized, its public spaces accessed, was something which was distinctly emerging through my pilot study. And so the observations that I had at the end of my pilot study were, why were the local ancestral agrarian community significant group in the formation of this educated middle class, social class distinction? And what are the existing theoretical frameworks that we can use as a way of understanding what is happening within the city and how that is informing the way in which the educated middle class is manifesting its own distinction? Yes, sorry. Did I? No. So spatial space and the social class is not new. The kind of relationship has been explored through gentrification, revanchism, spatial sedimentation, inequality. There is a plethora of work that existed when I started to read up about social class. I realized I was at a point of time where social class was taking a cultural turn, but the aspect of space wasn't catching up to this cultural turn to social class. However, the roots of looking at space within the framework of cultural turn to social class existed. And so I had to go back to the drawing board, try and figure out how this could possibly work. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about in terms of the framework that I reached at draw both from the work that has previously been done in terms of spatialization of social class, but also takes into account the cultural turn to social class. It is deeply embedded in Bourdieusian ideas of space and distinction. And so that is what I went back to. In the Indian context, cities have some relationship to middle class. So we can see roughly through inference, we can derive a certain relationship between the ways in which cities have developed. The state-led urbanization in the post-independence India was largely led to the formation of a state-protected middle class, a section of middle class that became the dominant way in which urban spaces also reflected thought and had a relationship with the state and the space. And so that kind of led me into thinking about what had happened previously. So I looked up some of the texts and Kundu's work on looking at urbanization in different forms of urban spaces within India and the kind of middle class that colonial urbanization brought forth. Again, pointed to the fact that when you change the character of the space or something happens with respect to the space, it manifests itself in terms of the ways in which middle class is expressing itself, the ways in which it thinks and consolidates itself. So, which led me to think about two things which were happening at the time when I was trying to do this work. One was that there was a large-scale urbanization of peri-urban fringes, which was happening which was underway in Bangalore. It was happening in Delhi, and it was already planned for Hyderabad. which meant that this is the way in which urbanization is going to progress. And so this was happening instead of the expected turn of urbanization, which was that megacities will grow towards and consume their peripheries. This was slightly different. This was urbanization of the peri-urban fringes, which was happening. And so this becomes the familiar way in which urbanization has progressed in India. The other bit which was happening, and these are independently studied phenomena, so peri-urbanization has been studied extensively. Some of CSH reports and papers were very, very helpful because I really needed the literature on peri-urbanization and some of the ways in which Veronique Dupont already talks about it, helped me think through some of those ideas. The other simultaneously happening phenomena that was looked at was the rise of this new section of middle class. However, the two were not connected. And my instinct said that there was something there that needed to be identified, something that needed to be concretely put down. So contestation over city space and how to claim it was so important to the middle class in Gurugram, because Ragiri is informed by this idea that city spaces and city roads and streets are not fundamentally safe. And therefore, we need to do something to make them safer. Now, how, and that becomes the place from which we start talking about. So the middle class section is talking extensively about road rage instances of sexual harassment on the street, instances of all kinds of accidents and lawlessness on the street, which is informing their sense of what the city should look like. And they're constantly in that dialogue. The other end of the dialogue is held up by the LAAC, which again, I look at Thomas Cowan's work. And because I did not actively engage with the local ancestral agrarian community, I was heavily dependent on Thomas Cowan's work on the local ancestral agrarian community, which only helped me solidify some of the things that I'm going to talk about. Sorry. So Gurugram has had a very significant kind of a growth, which I love the word that Dorothy uses for it, which is steroidal. It is nothing short of steroidal, the kind of growth that it has had between 1990s and 2010. This kind of urbanization was not aimed at expansion. Like I said, that the expected understanding is that if urbanization is going to progress, the mega cities are going to expand outwards. However, these were peri-urban fringes which were being developed, and part of the peri-urban fringe or peri-urbanization that becomes significant for our purposes is the fact that peri-urban fringes have rural local body. They are characterized to a large extent by agricultural or agricultural dominated activities. And they are proximate to these mega cities. So they have not been developed. They are largely rural, but they're close to some of these big cities. Most notable in this context being the part of the city called the New Gurugram. So there was an old Gurugram and there is a new Gurugram, and the NH8 cuts right in the middle. And so the story as it goes was that the old Gurugram was the district center. Originally, it was the trade town. It was commercially important to begin with. It was both administratively and commercially important to begin with, and it has a long history of it. New Gurugram was largely farmlands that were acquired and then developed ground up and very quickly. So the kind of development that we see on New Gurugram side is fundamentally different from the kind of development which is happening in the old Gurugram section. Now, this urbanization was characterized by the private real estate developers leading the charge. There was a large amount of housing or residential real estate, which was developed. There is a coexistence of spatial patches of rurality and urbanity, which means that either, and this was my own experience of fieldwork, wherein there is a gated enclave which is sitting right in the middle, but either sides of it is just absolutely barren land to the farthest stretches that you can see. So that's something which is very prevalent at the time. There is an exception is the key mode of production of space at this level, and there are a number of scholars who talk about it. But Guru Rani's idea of flexible planning is the most appropriate in terms of thinking through it. because there are regulations. However, those regulations are defined, one, loosely, and there is always a possibility of revising some of those in terms of getting things done the way that you want to. Um, what ends up happening is that there is an MCG, which is the Municipal Corporation of Gurgaon. There is the RWAs in some of these gated enclaves because these are privately managed, cordoned off spaces. And then there are these Kha panchayats that are coexisting in terms of their sovereignty and their rules and their ideas of what it means to be a community, how to access or control um, or just be in the city space. The gated enclaves, their high walls and their tall gates mark the outside disorder, which is a constantly presented metaphor of control of. So think of Caldeira's work in terms of Sao Paulo and the way that she's talking about how there is a certain kind of living which is being sold. And all of it holds true of Gurgaon's real estate development at the time because it is talking about a serene living, somehow actualizing a higher potential in you, but also a sense of being away from the city or kind of isolation as a way of thinking about empowerment. So some of these elements are retained. Oftentimes, these gated enclaves are presented also by the middle class as being orderly, as being the space which is occupied by people who are civic, educated, and extremely law-abiding. So this sense of order within and disorder outside is what also goes into arguing the case for gated enclaves or their advertisement appeal. But it also informs a certain kind of a discourse about the city space, its relationship with the city. So this is a section of middle class that is not very happy about the ways in which the city space is. Uh, and wants to and has this stronghold space of gated enclaves as a way of presenting their big numbers or their lobbying power. A similar pattern of development can be seen in places like ITPL or Electronic City in Bangalore, Cyberabad in Hyderabad, ECR and OMR in Chennai, among the most notable ones. So this is the manner in which this is the kind of development which is happening. Again, some of this qualifies as the special economic zone, and I can elaborate about that bit of detail if there are questions. But in the interest of what was happening in Gurgaon, it helps us think about how Gurgaon is being urbanized in terms of some of these overlapping narrative threads, which I like to think about. And I did not try to consolidate it into one very neat kind of a narrative. So I let them sit side by side. They all end up saying pretty much finding their way to each other. The first bit of information, the first bit of important narrative thread that I felt was with regards to the geopolitical boundaries of Gurgaon as a district. Now, it's important for us to understand that this had been always going through some bit of change or alteration constantly. And so starting from 1861, when Gurgaon district is for the first time enumerated, it has Firozpur, Jeet Nu, Palwal, and Rewari. And then, so this is part of the commercial aspect of the district. However, as a political unit, Gurugram, Rohtak, and Hisar became one unit that would constitute an electoral unit to elect a member to the Punjab Legislative Council. In 1916, Ballabgarh Tehsil was taken from Delhi and was added to Gurugram. Again, 1950, some parts of Gurgaon district were lost to Rajasthan. Some were gained then from Pataudi state and Pepsu, which is Patiala and East Punjab State Union. Gurgaon continued to be part of Punjab until its separate state was formed in 1966. Even then, in 1972, Rewari Tehsil was moved in from Mahendragarh district. The most significant change, though, happened when Faridabad came about. So Faridabad was cut away as a separate district from Gurgaon district. Now, what this reconfiguration does is, in fact, the political and the administrative control becomes a bit, I would not say weak, but malleable, shifting constantly, which what it does is basically it makes the political and the administrative control seem abstract, less relevant, and open to the possibility of a future change. And therefore, it does not quite sink deep. Why it is important is because this leads to the more local level administrative units of panchayats and khaps become far more significant and important in terms of their administrative and political power than they would have if it had been a structured administrative unit or had a significant time of as a structured political unit in terms of legislation and land deals. And so this shows up also in terms of land deals because KP Singh, who was the head, who continues to be the head of DLF, Delhi Land and Finance, after his stint got abruptly cut down with the coming of DDA, shifted his attention to Gurgaon and what was available in Gurgaon and could be maneuvered with. And therefore, he, in his own biography, talks about how he managed to crack land deals with some of these people because these groups of farmers coming from the dominant castes of Jats and Yadavs, often he would find like a familial kinship kind of a link with them and start talking to them about making a land deal. This went hand in hand with the kind of legislations that came about. And three legislations become key in terms of thinking about this. This is the 1963 Punjab Scheduled Roads and Controlled Area Restriction of Unregulated Development Act. What this did was this basically notified that these are the areas that that will be urbanized next. So these are next in the plan. Followed by the 1972 Haryana Urban and Land Ceilings Act, which opened up the possibility of inviting private developers to express interest in urbanizing these areas. Followed by 1975 Haryana Development and Regulation of Urban Areas Act, which would allow you to change the land use pattern. And therefore, the way that this kind of arrangement worked is that the 1963 Act would go and notify that these are the areas that would be urbanized next, which means that the government has already expressed its interest in urbanizing these areas or acquiring these areas, which puts the farmers into a lot of stress, followed by 1972 Act allowing for private developers to come in and argue that they are the ones that can develop this land much more efficiently. The government accepts the tender. They go and meet with the farmers and they say, so they go and meet with the farmers and they say that if the government acquires it, the government will acquire it and you will be at a loss. We are willing to offer you better prices for the land. And so acquiring the land and then approaching the government with the intent to urbanize it within the 72 Act. And then once you have found, once it has been legalized and you have been, it is an agreement between the government and the private actors that you are going to be the one that's going to develop the area. Then 1975 Act comes in because there is a cap of about 35% processing land, which means that it should generate net profit worth. So it has to give financial returns. However, housing as a real estate development is profitable, but it does not create exchange. And therefore, the 75 Act becomes important in terms of changing the land use pattern to benefit real estate housing development, which again is sold at massive profit. Again, ticking off the local ancestral agrarian community that realizes that the land that they were paid a certain amount for now is generating a profit which is far beyond what they were led to believe. And they obviously want a share in it, which they have not been provided. And therefore, that is the kind of conflict that exists there. Urbanization happened in Gurgaon in two phases. One was the state-led, which was the setting up of the Maruti manufacturing unit in 60s and 70s. So this is Maruti Suzuki plant came around 70s, 80s. And with it, what happened was because this was within the larger framework of industrial areas. And so this was state-developed or state-backed kind of development, which led to urbanization in a very specific kind of a way. How this is fundamentally different is that the state has a certain responsibility of gaining legitimacy within urbanization. So the ways in which its urbanization plans need to garner greater legitimacy, and therefore the housing is ancillary. The land is developed to generate profit and productivity, and therefore that's being the primary focus. Housing is um, ancillary, and it's supposed to boost the usability of the land. Um, However, what happened in the second phase, which is the private developers-led urbanization, was fundamentally different because there is no commitment to social justice, no need for for legitimacy. All legitimacy is being drawn from this world-class aesthetic that is being developed. And therefore, that kind of urbanization functions very differently. So the map that you can see right now, the yellow portion is the portion that existed. This is the growth that existed um, before the plant became functional. And so orange is where it started developing once the plant was functional. And the purple is what has happened within this neoliberal urbanization pattern. In terms of settlement, the way that it was described was that it was waves of settlement that came through Gurgaon. The first wave of settlement came to it as suburban spaces of Delhi. So people working in Delhi, not able to afford land or housing in Delhi, shifted to Gurgaon. And this was a smaller population. This was not numerically significant, followed by the ones that moved to Gurgaon because of the Maruti plant, followed by the large chunk of population that moved due to the neoliberal urbanization. Now, why is that significant is that at no point in the previous two waves were the numbers of the middle class ever significant enough for it to overtake or push its own kind of understanding of what the city should be. Only when it matched the power and the clout and the numbers, when it became significant in the city, a significant presence in the city, is when this conflict is starting to play out much more actively. No. Oh, sorry. So this is exactly what I talked about. So some of these things I've already talked about. There is a shifting political administrative boundaries that has landed. Agrarian community organized around relations of caste came to dominate the local socio-spatial dynamics in Gurgaon. And so now they have an understanding of what it means to own space, what it means to occupy space, which is fundamentally different from the ways in which this migrant, educated section of middle class thinks about being in the space, owning the space, living in the space, being present. The spatial practices and social organization of the space were instead determined by elites along the lines of caste and patriarchal control, which meant, in part, it meant that honor was extremely important. Caste hierarchy and caste kinship was extremely important. If a violation occurred, it's an attack on honor. It's not a civil violation. It's an attack on honor and should be dealt with differently. And so these fundamentally different ways of thinking about the space or one's relationship with the space. Now, local ancestral agrarian community also believes that because their ancestors grew up in this land and this land has been owned by their ancestors, that they have a sense of belongingness here, and therefore it should be run according to their own sensibilities. Meanwhile, the educated middle class believes that because there are contracts and there is a property deal and they have property ownership, property rights within the city, and therefore there should be a different way in which the city should be accessed and should be functioning. A new section of migrant middle class, which is significant in number, comparable in material wealth. And so suddenly what has also happened is that the basis of claiming entitlement or the basis of claiming power within the space has changed. From the fact that your caste identity and how much land you own, it has suddenly turned into what kind of work you do. But for local ancestral agrarian community, resignation from manual labor was what classified their entitlement. And therefore, this is a fundamental change into having to think about labor defining your identity. And so this kind of starts to play out. The migrant middle class is seen as wanting to change the social organization of the space and spatial practices to be more aligned with their own habitus, which means that it should be orderly, it should be procedural, it should be extremely predictable in some ways. And so that's seen as that becomes the fundamental conflict. Why this is important is because we are used to thinking about social class, even within the cultural turn that social class boasts of, as being a function in some senses of the ways in which, being a function of habitus, capital, um, and field. Now, Bourdieu's field theory allows us to take into account not just, so usually what happens is in the cultural turn to social class, we give a lot of importance to capital and we give a lot of importance to habitus, but field somehow becomes slightly less talked about. So my job or my mission became to turn this around a little bit, go to Bourdieusian field theory as a way of thinking about centralizing space in terms of understanding its relationship to social class. Now, the one thing that he does give us is the reciprocal externalization of positions, which then, when you impose upon the space, then you can easily bring in Doreen Massey and what is happening in terms of feminist geography to understand capitalist relations, to understand how field itself creates certain kinds of fractures. Now, the capital and habitus's relationship to field becomes then important. So this is not a middle class that did not know where to go for its distinction. This is a middle class which is looking at urban sophistication, English education, it's looking at its labor, it's looking at all the ways of lawfulness as their distinction. But those already existed. Those are not some things that randomly get picked up to express one's distinction within the field. The fractures of the field are fundamental to defining the ways in which certain aspects of the habitus will get played up to mark one's distinction within the field. And so I found it immensely interesting to think about how those fractures, because there is a competing claim by the local ancestral agrarian community that cannot boast of English education, it cannot boast of urban sophistication. Meanwhile, this migrant educated middle class, which is moving to Gurgaon, is already a second generation middle class that has grown up with English education. And so this becomes the immediate go-to way in which to claim distinction. And so that was my aha moment. And that is my contribution to taking forward, thinking about space and social class. So in conclusion, the book highlights this need to study concurrent phenomena, which is the rise of the new urbanization pattern and new identities as co-constitutive. The book proposes new ways of thinking about the relationship between social class distinction and space. And the book is an invitation then to rethinking social class as situated in fractures of social space, which is what led me to write what I wrote about for the book jacket, which was, is New York middle class the same as New Delhi middle class? But New Delhi middle class will emerge out of the fractures of the space within which it is situated. And so that is the thesis. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Smriti, for so much being on time. And I think we have a lot of time to discuss and engage with your work. So before I give floor to Ishita, maybe I think for long we are trying to grasp what is this new emerging middle class, right? And to understand this shift from middle class to new middle class. And especially it is closely tied with the liberalization and opening up of the economy. So I think we are trying to grasp it qualitatively rather than solely looking at economic aspect of it. And I think in that way, it helps us in understanding what is this new middle class by looking at the spatialization. Where do they reside? What do they consume? And what are their cultural practices? So I think in that way, your work is immensely contributing to this understanding of what is this newly emerging middle class of India. So with that, I hand over to Ishita for her remarks and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Smriti, I definitely cannot keep up with that kind of presentation. What I'm going to do is I'll try and talk about how Smriti's work helps me understand the context that I right now work and live in. I live in Sonipat, while there are a lot of differences between Sonipat and Gurgaon. But it's also the way Smriti asks us to think about the social class and the social distinction through the spatialization. That has actually helped me raise some of the questions that also is helping us understand this new urban space of Sonipat, where we are also trying to work together. So especially for someone who is an architect and urban designer, and yeah, I steal from every discipline I can to understand what's happening. What really struck me was the similarity was the rapid neoliberal restructuring that's happening in the peri-urban region. Though Sonipat is not as, you use the words on steroids or steroidal, yes, it is not. It has been pretty slow, and there's been a lot of discussion about why that is happening, and it's also picking up. Yeah, but I think majorly the difference has also been Sonipat's urbanization is through the private education-led urbanization that has been planned, which brings in with it very different kinds of jobs. It also still brings in the educated middle class, but a slightly different kind also. But what is the similarity is this manifestation of the class distinction, which then starts to show up in the physicality, in the materiality, also in the way people are assumed to occupy space, use space outside their private space, also how the public space is also then governed, and you think of how it should be used. Something that is also common from what I also read in the news and from your work also, that in these peri-urban areas, the large-scale private real estate, it outpaces the development of the state-led infrastructure. So what you end up happening is these islands of world-class amenities. However, in order to, when you get out of it, you probably wading through flood, you're wading through broken, potholed road infrastructure, or you do have these pockets where these roads are also built properly, but the other areas are not. This is a similarity that I've been also seeing around where I live, and in Gurgaon also. And I think somewhere this is also happening because of this sudden shift from agrarian landscape to an urban landscape. And because also these creates these fault lines that Smriti is then talking about. When these global capitals starts to intersect with local social histories and political dynamics. And, how Gurgaon also has a very different kind of the administrative history and the way it progressed other than Sonipat. Now I'll come to the very interesting part that helps me understand. I am the educated middle class in Sonipat. So this tension that happens between the educated middle class and the local ancestral agrarian community that you talk about. This because I actually study bastis, informal settlements, and I study mostly inner city areas. So this is for the first time I'm also living and trying to make sense of the urban periphery. Now, in here, while there is a conflict and a distinction, the fact that they are materially, economically, they are comparable, it throws up a very different challenge. Of course, their means of economics is very different. One is, they've derived the wealth from either land sales, and the other from high salaries from working in these. But materially, I can also see that it gets manifested where they start driving high-end cars. Also, it's the way their housing is starting to look like. And one thing that is also common between them is that most of them have very similar symbolic capital because they are from the Savarna caste. Now, the difference here is what I would say, I found Vanessa Watson talks about it very nicely in Conflicting Rationalities, where she had used it to talk about how the municipality actually talks about what is the idea of a proper citizen or proper living environment when they were designing, when they were upgrading an informal settlement. So what I see in Gurgaon and Sonipat is that now we have these groups who are economically and symbolically, they have very comparable positions. However, when it comes to social cultural tensions, they're actually competing with each other. So within that, then the educated middle class starts to harden its space through its habitus, which I think you've also talked about it as the metropolitan habitus that Butler talks about. The gated enclave becomes their spatial strongholds. And they start to establish their premises through, legality, property rights, moral codes of, middle-class codes. So one of the things that I'm now going to talk about and probably raise some questions is, okay. I mean, you're talking about how the educated middle class is then spatializing power, right? So within these islands of globality, at the peri-urban, they're actually doing something very different than what they end up doing in the inner city. Now, because I'm very new to the peri-urban, I would like to ask you, what are these differences that, what happens in these islands of globality in the peri-urban, and how this middle class then acts very differently in the peri-urban because of its particular geography, because of the way it's actually spatially organized? What are those peculiarities?
Thank you. It's really nice when friends comment on your work. It's the best of academic practice. So yes, I mean, I feel like some of the things that you're talking about become the core of this kind of work. I would though raise a little bit of a disjuncture from what you observed, which is that there is a comparability of symbolic capital. At one level, yes, it is justified because these are castes. So the castes that were landed in Gurgaon before this kind of neoliberal urbanization took over were intermediary castes. They were not the uppermost castes. However, the educated middle class, which is coming in, is predominantly upper caste. And therefore, when there is a clash between those two kinds, the upper caste expresses its dominance in terms of the caste stronghold of the upper caste, which was education. Their education, they're being able to claim respectability on the basis of their education is the existing caste repertoire that did exist. And therefore, I would, in very subdued ways, the educated middle class would talk about how these Yadavs, Jats, Gujars, they are very, very aware of the caste identity of this comparable local ancestral agrarian community that has material wealth which is comparable to them. So that is definitely there. In terms of just responding to what you observed, this is very interesting because I had a lecture with some of our students who threw up interesting questions. And so one of the things that we get to see happening within these gated enclaves, and I hope this answers the question that you have raised. What happens is that because they get cordoned off, and this is a context which is slowly grappling with the coming of administrative and political control in structured ways. What happens is that these gated enclaves become stronghold of the middle class, and the RWA becomes the way in which some of these are administered, they are controlled, there are rules, there are so these arguments become place where the state also finds itself on a little shaky ground. And I'll give you examples of this because there were a number of bachelor men who dragged the RWA to court in Gurgaon because of the kind of impositions that RWA was working out. For instance, no partying, no having single friends over. So these kind of arguments, these kind of moral codes, when the RWA started imposing, it led to legal battle between citizens of the state and an RWA, which at that point, then you are looking at a, a body which is beginning to exert its own influence, asking for the state to stay away from the privately cordoned off space. So it's manifesting this privately cordoned off space as being a space of exception. Why that becomes significant in the course of where we are currently is because then those spaces of exception become a way of thinking about oneself as being in Gurgaon, but also being elsewhere. So you are here, but you're also not here. You're living in Gurgaon, but you are existing in a whole different space altogether. And that you get to do because you also get to push the state outwards. Another example that I took, which I find very, very interesting, which happened not in Gurgaon, but in Noida, where Mahagun gated enclave there were employees, middle-class employers within Mahagun gated enclave who were accused of abusing their domestic help, keeping her in captivity, and at which point the slum where her family lived mobilized people from within the slums, and they reached the gates of the gated enclave and they were agitating. At which point the middle class gated enclave called the police to manage this crowd and dissipate them from the gates of the RWA. Which is to say something, because the Basti people were not able to mobilize police support to look for this girl who is being held in captivity. The girl is returned, but then the people are obviously angry about what has happened. But the police is not supporting the people who are agitating, but is actually defending the right of the RWA being able to keep its own rules inside. So the way that they present themselves is that this area is free of criminality, and therefore we need the police to manage the space outside. But we don't want the police or the state to come in and help us manage the space inside. This idea of the state staying outside this space of exception has led to a number of legal battles. And I hope this answers.
Yes, yes. Thank you. There's something interesting in your book where you also talk about that there is a lack of homogeneity within the citizens who are inside too. And while they're all kind of exempt from the surveillance, because what they're really trying to do with the surveillance camera is try to pick up anybody who doesn't look like they belong there. But the kind of surveillance that also happens within, and the hierarchy that is there within the occupiers, and, you know, I'm talking about the renters and tenants and all those, if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is interesting because instinctually one would think that if middle class is finding like its spatial stronghold, it's going to come together, it's going to have the greatest sense of community because now they have arrested the rules by which the space should be governed, they are all alike, they all have property rights, so on and so forth. And therefore this would be the most socially homogeneous set of people who would have the highest sense of community. But that doesn't happen. Because by design, these gated enclaves are spaces which are built around the idea of isolating oneself from the larger context. And therefore, that idea still stays when the boundaries are cordoned off and the space is now secured. And therefore, once the outside city has been shut out, there are gradations that emerge within people who are living inside the gated enclaves. And so I talk about this in terms of the rentiers, the transients, and the owners. The owners are the ones that end up defining the rules of being inside the gated enclaves, even though they are significantly fewer as compared to transients and spiralists combined. And so this kind of becomes the way in which they express themselves. They believe that the others have lesser stakes because they are not owners, they are tenants, and so they will move. And therefore, they are not invested in the gated enclave or the way that it should be administered, and therefore it should only be Owners Welfare Association, not an RWA, but an Owners Welfare Association. And they should be the ones that should get to formulate rules and regulations in terms of who can stay in, how many cars can be parked, whether or not you can have parties, whether or not you should be roaming around, what time, what not. And so this kind of surveillance then turns inside as well. It's looking for people who do not belong, or those who are coming in from outside the city, outside the gated enclaves inside, constantly monitoring their movement and disciplining their existence. But it is also looking at other people who are living within the gated enclaves as having somehow lesser belongingness to the gated enclaves. So yes, that's something that I do talk about in the book.
I'm going to keep asking questions connected to this. Does temporality play a role in the way people are seen to belong in there? So temporality could be for how long they have been living there, how long they have owned the place, rented the place, and is gender, caste, and probably class, even I'm not assuming it is quite homogeneous, that also end up playing a role in this inner surveillance that takes place within the society.
In terms of how does sorry, you'll have to.
So I'm looking at mainly the main thing I want to understand is what happens in these peri-urban areas. They get filled up very slowly. One is, there is a lag and it remains unoccupied for a long time, unlike the inner city areas. While the inner city area is also hollowing out. But so I want to understand if those have an impact on the governance, this idea of the moral codes, the surveillance, any of these.
So increasingly, even with Gurugram, as if you are keeping up with any bit of real estate pricing, Gurugram property is also becoming extremely hard to own. And so the pattern of ownership is stagnating at this level, at this point. The other bit which is interesting is temporality of it becomes interesting because when you begin thinking about this, temporality cannot be the way in which you claim ownership to the city, because you go to temporality, there is a LAAC that is sitting there to beat you to it. They would claim ownership of the land since the time that it belonged to their forefathers and grandfathers and so on and so forth. So that's not where they're going. They're primarily focusing on property ownership as the first way in which to associate with the city, because it means not temporality in the sense of how long I have existed, but how long I propose to live here. And so there is a sense of futurity that I am going to be living here because I have bought a property here. I am planning to live in the city for the longest possible imaginable time. And therefore, I am vested in the way in which the city is organized, structured, and is run. So in that sense, not so much temporality in the sense of how long I have been, but how long I am likely to stay here. So yeah.
Okay, we have come to an end because it's 6:30. So I would like to thank both Smriti for this fine-grained presentation, and thank you so much, Ishita, for accepting our invitation as a discussant. Thank you. If you all have questions, you can take it outside. Thank you so much.